Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the weekly seminar series here at the Dahdaleh Institute for Global Health Research at York University. My name is James Rubinski, and I'm the director of the Dahdaleh Institute for Global Health Research. And I'm delighted today to invite James Stinson and Lee McLoughlin, who will be leading today's seminar. And the seminar title is Smart Conservation and the Futures of Planetary Health. And before we begin the formal presentation, the formal discussion, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Indigenous land that we are on. And I'll just remind everyone this is a hybrid event, so some guests are on different territories. So please do take a moment to give thanks and respect to the land on which you are physically located. And today we are here at York University campus in Toronto, and we're situated on the traditional territorial area known as Takaronto, and we acknowledge its current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and we also acknowledge that this is traditional territory of many Indigenous nations, which include the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat, and of course the Métis. And this territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which is an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. And with that, let me just introduce Jim, or James Stinson, or as we call him, Jim. Jim is a postdoctoral fellow at the Faculty of Education here at York, and he's also a research fellow here at the Dahdaleh Institute. And his research explores Indigenous-led conservation, digital media and technologies, and nature-based recreation, as these are used in efforts to preserve biodiversity and promote planetary health. Jim is currently a principal investigator on two SSHRC-funded projects, and is co-PI with Kate Tillage, who's here today. Hi, Kate. At the Partnership for Youth and Planetary Wellbeing. Jim's current research examines the use of digital surveillance technologies and artificial intelligence, including spatial monitoring and reporting tools, and how these influence environmental governance and the shifting relations of power in and around parks and protected areas. He has many academic publications, and I'm not going to go through them, but he's published in some pretty prestigious, quote-unquote, academic journals and venues, Geoform, Environment Planning, and he's written for The Conversation, also for the Canadian Climate Institute, and also for Mountain Life, Wildlife Australia. And he's also facilitated the production of several Indigenous films that have been used for the United Nations Youth Climate Report. And Lee, who's also presenting today with Jim, is a PhD research assistant here at the Dahdaleh Institute, and he's now pursuing a PhD in global socio-cultural studies, where he's applying a political ecology approach to understand and analyze motivations behind the different approaches to protected areas, and particularly in Belize. And Lee previously worked as a program director for a local NGO in Belize, and I believe the pronunciation, Lee, you can correct me if I'm wrong, is the Yachik Conservation Trust.
It's pretty good.
Good?
Pretty good,
okay,
yeah.
Well, I never know what to do with some of those extra non-vowel letters.
Yeah.
But thank you. It said Lee's also worked at the Wildlife Conservation Society to improve, also in Mesoamerica, to improve protected areas and their management across Central America, and also with the view to building public support to protect forests in the region. Lee's currently working with Jim here at York on the Smart Conservation and Production of Nature project. And so today's seminar, both Jim and Lee will outline the new global biodiversity framework that was adopted at the Convention on Biological Diversity in Montreal. So I'm actually particularly interested in seeing what that framework looks like, and I'm particularly interested and excited about listening to you on that. They'll also discuss conservation-related violence and displacement of Indigenous people around the world that's actually caused by the expansion of conservation areas to meet the global agreement targets. So there's a deep irony there, I think, and I'd love to hear your reflections on that. They're then going to propose, as a sustainable approach to conservation, an effort that cares for both people and planet. And before I just turn it over to Jim and Lee, I just remind everybody it's a 1-hour seminar. We're going to have about a 20-minute or so presentation by Jim and Lee, and then we'll follow with about 30 minutes of question and discussion. And I'm going to wrap up pretty tightly at around 1:55 so that people can get their next obligation at 2 o'clock. I just remind people the seminar is being recorded. Please mute your microphone unless you're presenting or asking a question or engaged in discussion. And please use the little raise the hand button at the bottom of your screen if you want to make a comment or engage discussion. And so with that, I'll just turn it over to you, Jim, and to Lee. So welcome. You're on mute, Jim.
Of course, classic. James, thank you very much for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here virtually with you all, and exciting to be able to share with you, along with Lee, a little bit about this project that we've been working on, looking at the role of sort of emerging digital and smart technologies in the context of conservation. So I'll just share my slides. So the title of our presentation is Smart Conservation and the Futures of Planetary Health. Really what we're looking at today in this presentation is the role of emerging smart technologies, and specifically surveillance technologies, in the context of both environmental and human well-being. So this presentation, or during this presentation, we're going to be presenting some of the preliminary results of our SSHRC-funded project, Smart Conservation and the Production of Nature 3.0 in Belize. This project is looking at the role of the spatial monitoring and reporting tool. This is a digital platform that's used to promote conservation law enforcement and monitoring in parks and protected areas around the world. It's used very widely in over, I think, 70 countries and over 1,100 different parks and protected areas around the world. And our project is looking at the use of that technology specifically in Belize, Central America. The research that we've been doing has really included 3 major types of data. We've done literature review on conservation and technology, semi-structured interviews with both conservation professionals working in the conservation sector using these technologies, as well as with community members living around and bordering parks and protected areas. And finally, ethnographic participant observations. So Lee and I have both been doing research in Belize, working alongside park rangers for the most part, as well as park managers working in their offices, to understand how these technologies are being used to manage parks and protected areas and to enforce protected area regulations and laws. So I'll just begin. We're going to be providing a brief overview of some of the preliminary findings of this project, specifically looking at the changing dynamics of surveillance within parks and protected areas and the impact of that on people and communities bordering protected areas and the relationship of those communities to protected area management organizations. But I just want to begin by sort of contextualizing this research within broader trends in conservation and planetary health to try to give you a sense of what the significance of this work is and why it's important. So from December 7th to 19th, 2022, world leaders and policymakers and representatives of civil society organizations assembled in Montreal at the 15th Conference of the Parties, referred to as COP15. This was a meeting of the Convention on Biological Diversity to work towards developing a new global agreement to conserve biodiversity around the world. The meeting was framed by organizers as an event that would decide, quote, the fate of the entire living world. And it aimed to create a new global framework to address the rapid loss of wildlife and biodiversity, increasingly understood by scientists as contributing to the linked crises of the Earth's sixth mass extinction event, as well as to the global climate crisis, both of which ultimately threaten to undermine Earth's life support systems, which humans depend on for their well-being. So in the early hours of December 19th, a new global biodiversity framework was agreed to and adopted, which was hailed as a, quote, paradigm-changing deal that would bend the curve of biodiversity loss and lead to what was referred to as a nature-positive society. At the core of this agreement is a somewhat controversial 30 by 30 target. This is an agreement to conserve 30% of both the Earth's land and freshwater areas, as well as the marine areas in the oceans by 2030. So working to achieve that goal will require a massive expansion of global protected areas, both on land and on sea, and something that will have significant consequences for communities, particularly communities living in high biodiversity areas and targeted biodiversity hotspots. And when we're thinking about who those communities are, it's widely recognized that up to 80% of the Earth's remaining biodiversity is currently located on territories inhabited by and controlled by Indigenous peoples. And up to 40% of the world's remaining forests are also on Indigenous territories. So this expansion of global protected areas has potentially significant consequences for Indigenous peoples specifically. And yeah, I'll get to what some of the reasons for that will be in a moment. But just to put this expansion of protected areas in a little bit of context, you can see on this image on the slide here, it maps out the increasing coverage of parks and protected areas around the world since the creation of the first park in the late 1800s at Yellowstone. And you can see, particularly since the 1950s, there has been a relatively dramatic global expansion of the coverage of parks and protected areas. But even with that expansion over the last few decades, the rate of expansion over the last sort of 10 or 20 years has been incredibly dramatic. So in 2010, for example, the Convention on Biological Diversity adopted the previous Aichi targets. Those were agreements to conserve 17% of land and 10% of marine areas. Those targets were actually not met, but during that 10-year period, there was actually a doubling of global protected areas. And even still, those targets were not quite met. And at the same time, there's widespread and high-profile conflicts between communities, and specifically Indigenous communities, that have been reported around the world, as communities have often been displaced from their traditional territories and homelands in order to create these new protected areas. So currently, efforts to meet the 30 by 30 target will require another doubling of land-based terrestrial protected areas, as well as a tripling of marine protected area coverage in only 7 years to meet that 30-30 target. So again, we just want to highlight that we recognize that these efforts to conserve biodiversity are crucial, but are also highlighting that it's important to think about who's going to be bearing the brunt of the costs of these of this expansion of protected areas. So in thinking about the role and relationship between conservation and protected areas and communities, as well as planetary health, researchers, specifically social scientists working with communities, have documented that the creation of parks and protected areas have led to widespread displacements of local communities around the world, and particularly Indigenous communities. There aren't really clear and accurate stats on the number of people that have been displaced, but Mark Dowie, in his book Conservation Refugees, presents estimates of, tens of millions of people that have been displaced around the world in order to create parks and protected areas for conservation. At the same time, health researchers working with Indigenous communities and other local communities have recognized that displacement from land and territory often contributes to a loss of culture, status, and identity, can curtail aspirations from the future, reduce life opportunities, and that this often manifests, particularly for Indigenous peoples, in significant health issues and disparities. Again, at the same time, Indigenous peoples and other critics of conservation have also argued that this conservation displacement doesn't just have negative impacts on people and their communities, but has also facilitated the expansion of capitalism and specifically extractive industry, and has had a negative impact on biodiversity rather than working to protect biodiversity. So I think critics of this type of expansion of protected areas have been making the argument that expanding protected areas without considering the impacts on communities can be both bad for the health of communities and Indigenous peoples, as well as potentially bad for the health of the environment. So just to frame this project a little bit more, one of the reasons why we think it's important to look critically at this expansion of global protected areas also has to do with trends within conservation itself. Within the conservation sector and movement, there is, I think, a current conflict between different modes of conservation. One is more centered around Indigenous-led and community-based conservation that puts the needs of communities at the forefront. But there's also been a resurgence of what we would call enforcement first approaches to conservation, which are much more restrictive, and focused on enforcing conservation laws in fairly restrictive ways and policing of conservation area boundaries. So one of the major trends that we've been looking at in terms of this project and smart conservation has been a global reframing of biodiversity conservation as a global, or in terms of national and international security threats. And one of the reasons for that is an increasing focus on the illegal wildlife trade. So researchers have documented that over the past 10 years, starting around 2010, to the present, international institutions have been working to highlight and to reframe the illegal wildlife trade as a really serious issue of national security. And that has really changed some of the institutional dynamics around nature conservation. So for example, state institutions like the United States Department of State has become much more involved in conservation issues and working to address, again, conservation and biodiversity conservation as a security issue, and leveraging funding specifically to promote enforcement in order to secure national security. So we've seen this kind of discursive reframing of nature conservation as a security issue. And this has had significant impacts also on flows of conservation funding. So one of the impacts of this that we've seen is a significant shift of conservation funding from approaches to conservation that highlight the involvement of communities in conservation, so community-based approaches to conservation, towards what are called enforcement first approaches, which again highlight law enforcement and the policing of protected area boundaries and regulations. There's also been, as part of this, a shift away from efforts which in the past have tried to balance the needs of conservation and development, to use development funding as a way to create buy-in with communities in conservation. And again, shifting that funding away from development initiatives in conservation towards more strict policing efforts. So this move towards more enforcement-oriented approaches and policing in conservation has also been mirrored by a widespread engagement of the technology industry within conservation and environmental governance as well. Almost all of the big tech companies, from Google to Microsoft, Intel, Amazon, et cetera, have all been investing significant sums of money in technologies to promote environmental governance, climate adaptation and mitigation, and biodiversity conservation. Microsoft, for example, created a $50 million initiative called AI for Earth, where they've been giving grants to startups and conservation organizations to develop technologies using artificial intelligence to support conservation and climate initiatives. Through the engagement of the tech industry, one of the things that we've seen in conservation is a proliferation of all different types of new technologies, from satellites and drones and digital internet connected sensors to cloud computing platforms, artificial intelligence, Internet of Things technologies, and so on, mobile phones. All of these technologies are being used, promoted, and leveraged in new ways to try to support conservation in all kinds of ways. And so we've also seen the linking of these two trends, efforts to address the illegal wildlife trade as a security threat, and the use of these new technologies in order to do that. So we've seen a sort of a nexus or convergence between global conservation organizations and technology companies, which have increasingly been partnering and creating new funding mechanisms in order to promote the use of technology to combat wildlife crime and address the illegal wildlife trade. Development organizations also like USAID, the Inter-American Development Bank, as well as, again, environmental organizations like WWF, are all sort of working collaboratively to promote this new sort of technocentric mode of conservation to address this issue. And this ultimately leads us to SMART, the Spatial Monitoring and Reporting Tool, which is the focus of our study in Belize. So I'll pass it over to Lee to describe a little bit about what SMART is and how it's being used in Belize.
Thanks, Jim. So SMART began essentially as an open source app-based platform that could be taken out on patrols on handheld devices physically to collect observation data in the field on wildlife or wildlife crimes. It has been developed by initially, I think, 6 or 7 of these organizations, the logos you've seen. It's currently at 9. These are some of the biggest conservation NGOs in the world. They have a lot of influence at the global scale and the direction of conservation. And so this SMART tool has advanced very rapidly. It's become extremely popular, and largely because of its open source nature. It doesn't have a cost attached to it. and they've expanded trainings over a number of years now on the collation of these data that are collected on patrols, how to collect it in the field, and then the way that's collated in databases back at the ranger bases or the NGO offices or government offices, that is, and combined with things like GIS mapping software to provide a visual record of the patrols that have been done. And so the next slide, one of the aspects of that as it's developed over time, from those fairly modest beginnings, we're now at a situation where predictive patrolling is coming in. So it's not now solely a tool to look at what you've done and report on that. Now it's being integrated into larger big data systems. Jim mentioned Microsoft's AI for Earth. One of the programs they've developed is called PAWS, this Protection Assistant for Wildlife Security. This is specifically for anti-poaching. It's a predictive software that's being currently integrated with the spatial monitoring and reporting tool. And this, using large data sets, uses all of these ranger patrols that have been completed out in the field, and the data, the observations that have been collected on those, feeds that into the database, combines with the GIS mapping data and machine learning. And the idea is this is going to enable the prediction of locations of future illegal activity in protected areas. So there's been a decisive switch from a kind of a tool that looks at what's been done as a tool that looks what will be done. And the next slide. And so, yeah, initially SMART came in as an idea in Africa back in 2011. And as I said, it really has expanded in its scope very, very rapidly over time. By 2012, it was already being expanded out in Asia. And today it's reached 100 countries and 1,200 individual locations and counting. Yeah, over time it's being integrated at the various levels, either at single protected area levels or with certain agencies, and even at national levels, officially adopted by all protected areas and conservation agencies at national levels. And today it's being combined with hundreds of different sensors, as Jim mentioned, in the field. Yeah, on the next slide, I'll show you the extent of where that is globally on the map. You can see here that there's a rapid expansion in the global south, particularly. It's, like I said, it's been officially adopted at national level in 21 countries, but those are all in the global south. We haven't seen that adoption, with the exception of a couple in Scandinavia, of anywhere in the global north. So that obviously raises a lot of questions. And as a kind of case study of SMART's expansion, we, as per the title, we're looking at Belize in the Caribbean. You can see it on that global map there, but also zooming in here, Belize in Central America, but also on the Caribbean Sea. We can see that zooming into the next slide, we're going to see the protected areas system map. This is why Belize is a good case study for us to look at of this global expansion. It already has a lot of protected areas, already at 40% spatial coverage terrestrially, lagging somewhat behind in terms of the marine areas. The types of management of those protected areas are also notable in Belize. There's been a lot of co-management where government has formed arrangements with NGOs and communities to co-manage protected areas. And there's been a kind of switch from that kind of community cooperative, community-based cooperative management of protected areas towards, addressing the root causes of crime, or actually like moving towards a more enforcement approach. Like there's been a decisive shift, and we can see that in a couple of these images. There's been a switch towards the kind of police style or militarization of rangers, moving away from those more communal level approaches. So Belize was an early national adopter of SMART. As I mentioned, it's up to 21 countries globally have it adopted officially at a national level, but Belize was fairly early in that, back in 2018. And on the next slide, we're just going to quickly go through the timeline for that. It was initially deployed in Belize in the marine realm with the Wildlife Conservation Society and the Fisheries Department. And then later that became replicated terrestrially. And then, as I mentioned, in 2018, it was endorsed at a national level. And then more recently, just last year, there's been a rollout of this SMART 7, which takes us back to what we're talking about here as the predictive patrolling. It's a new plug-in add-on for SMART, which is going to kind of shift that approach to looking at whether the data that's been collected in Belize can be used for prediction, and so can tell rangers where to go and patrol rather than rangers deciding. And then in the bottom right of this slide, you can see this is kind of the dream of the protected area management or protected area managers. This dashboard that allows for a kind of almost real-time monitoring of illegal activities. You can see there's hotspots on here, and the idea would be that somebody could sit behind their desk and monitor illegal activities in almost real-time progress as they're detected on patrols. So I'll just hand back over to Jim for the next remaining slides.
We leave lots of time for discussion.
Okay, thank you, Lee. I will just run through some of the actual research findings relatively quickly, so we'll have some time to discuss. But that gives you a sense of like what SMART is as a platform. It's basically this digital platform that allows conservation organizations to collect data about what's happening in their parks and protected areas, increasingly in real time through cloud computing and digital sensors like internet connected cameras, drones, satellites, and so forth, that all feed into this system and creates this real-time data ecosystem so park managers can understand what's happening and increasingly can also predict where things will happen in the future and respond to those in real time. So one of the ways we've been theorizing this sort of digital transition in conservation and protected area management is through this concept of ontopower, which was developed by Brian Masumi, a Canadian philosopher. He developed this concept of ontopower to think critically about changes in global security, specifically since the War on Terror. And this concept of ontopower was really developed by Masumi to sort of encapsulate a shift in sort of military, but also in policing context, away from efforts to address the root causes of crime and global security threats, increasingly toward efforts to be able to take preemptive action, to be able to preempt and stop events from actually having taken place in the future. Bram Buescher, a European-based political ecologist, has argued that in the context of nature conservation, we can apply this concept of ontopower to analyze and make sense of how organizations are trying to prevent nature's destruction in the future by taking preemptive measures in the present. And that's one of the things that we see the makers of SMART are promoting it in terms of its capabilities and what it's being meant to do. So just a couple quotes here. With SMART 7, our ability to detect and respond to threats in real time will shift from a focus where poaching has happened to where it is about to happen. And then similarly, SMART's own analysis looks at the past, and PAWS complements this analysis by providing predictions about what to do in the future. So we see increasingly this technology is being used to allow conservation organizations to move from a reactive position of reacting to crime that's already occurred to being able to take preemptive action in response to this real-time data that's coming in. So in order to facilitate this type of preemption, what's really needed is massive flows of big data and what is referred to by many in this area as total surveillance. And this is very much in line with models and thinking around smart cities being applied to a conservation context, where flows of big data and sort of proliferation of surveillance technologies throughout an environment increasingly allows for this type of preventative action. And this involves a shift in the dynamics of surveillance itself. So within conservation, but also within policing, it's recognized that in the past, surveillance technologies and methodologies like police patrols in cities or ranger patrols in parks were often used as a mechanism of deterrence to try to deter people from committing crimes. Whereas increasingly, we see surveillance technologies that are being used specifically not as a deterrent. They're actually meant in many cases to be almost invisible and indetectable and ubiquitous throughout an environment, simply so that crimes and illegal activity can be detected as quickly as possible. So there's a shift away from efforts to try to prevent or deter crime towards simply trying to detect it as quickly as possible. And it involves this sort of ubiquitous spread of almost invisible surveillance technologies throughout an environment. So we can see just some images of what this sort of looks like in practice and the types of data visualizations that are being created by this. This also involves a shift in the role of communities within conservation. Lee mentioned earlier that within Belize specifically, there has been a heavy involvement of communities as partners in conservation. Communities have been enrolled in many cases to actually participate in the day-to-day management of parks and protected areas, and development projects have been promoted to sort of promote community development along the edges of conservation areas. Whereas with this new mode of conservation, we see this shift of communities from partners toward targets of surveillance, where the goal is really to simply be collecting as much data as possible from all sorts of sources, environmental sources, also human sources. And this involves the increasing sort of surveillance and securitization, not just of nature within the parks, but also of the communities bordering parks as well. So this raises important questions around data privacy and data privacy is one of the major issues that we've been looking at through this project, as communities increasingly become targets of this sort of invisible surveillance that's hard to detect. So just a couple of quotes from community members to give you an example of some of this. So one community member says, there are concerns where you're going to your milpa or your field, because you have to pass multiple people's farms and cameras might be there. So people are alarmed, like, why is this happening? I know there's instances where community members in my village, when they saw the camera, they pick it up and they throw it. So there's this kind of antagonistic relationship emerging where communities don't really know why these surveillance technologies are being used and deployed in the ways that they are. A couple other quotes. So what they don't do is they don't sensitize the community, what it's for. Like, people see a drone flying, like, what are you doing with that drone? And then, well, it's usually, and communities are very aware now that when they collect data. It's either to get a project or to get some funding, but it never reflects back on the community. It never comes back to where you collected the data. So there's a very fine balance between of people accepting this data collection because it never comes back to them. So there's this.
Jim, I wonder if I can ask you to wrap up so that we at least have a few minutes for comments and questions.
Yeah. Okay, so there's this issue of privacy and data collection and conflict with communities. There's also increasing instances of conservation-related violence that's directly related to this increasing imperative to intercept and preempt crime in protected areas. Lots of increasing shootings and shooting-related deaths in Belizean parks and protected areas. Also, lots of emergence of slow violence and negative impacts of people's access to resources being curtailed by this increasing focus on enforcement. Communities feeling like they're not benefiting anything from it. They're being excluded and displaced from their territories. And then just one final issue that I'll end on here is, so we have this widespread emphasis on sort of digitally enhanced surveillance and enforcement of protected areas. But I think one of the things that's important for us to think about and talk about, which Lee mentioned, is the way that this is being sort of spread and promoted around the world. That SMART is one of the leading conservation law enforcement technologies, but it's really only being deployed in the global south to police poor and racialized communities in the global south. And one of the issues that we're looking at is how that sort of geographical use of these technologies really mirrors some of the critiques of predictive policing in urban contexts, which have been found to disproportionately target racialized and poor communities in those contexts as well. There's also the issue of surveillance capitalism and data extraction, and the way that conservation, specifically in the global south, is being increasingly used to extract data to the benefit of global tech companies like Microsoft and Amazon, which are the main data sort of server providers for SMART. So yeah, I'll just end it there, and we can get into hopefully some conversation and questions. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks, Lee. You raised some incredibly important questions. I was just wondering, does anybody have any thoughts or comments right away here in the room or online? Go ahead, Kate.
Oh, thanks, James. Thanks so much, Jim and Lee. That is fascinating. And I'm particularly pleased that you're following this through in terms of what you're calling the algorithmic colonization and watching the unintended consequences. So I think we're going to have lots to talk about, because this, for me, mirrors social media and the well-being of young people. The way that big tech jumped into the fray and that they were there. And there are so many unintended consequences that may or may not be unintended around surveillance and who owns this land and who's free to move on that land, and at what cost will they do it. So I guess it's a comment. It's congratulations on this work. I think it's really important. And if you could just say a few more things about where you're hoping to take this next in terms of following through on these problematic and unintended consequences.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kate. I think that issue of data colonization and algorithmic colonization is definitely one of the sort of main issues that we want to keep looking into over the next year. So this project's ongoing basically for one more year. I think we've really just started looking into that, but I think it is really significant, and it does also tie into the social media element that you mentioned as well. So like one of the new elements of SMART actually is a community-based app that's now not just it's not just used by conservation organizations and rangers, but they actually now have a new app where they're encouraging people that live in communities bordering protected areas to basically download this smart app so that they can basically sort of inform on their own communities using their own smartphones and digital devices. So yeah, there's all sorts of issues around that type of data collection and issues of privacy around that. And I think, that issue that I mentioned right at the end, of how like big tech companies, for example, are benefiting from smart. There is some good emerging work in this area that we're hoping to contribute to through this project. But there's been criticisms of specifically of Microsoft's AI for Earth program. Eric Nost at the University of Guelph has written an article looking at one of their projects. And he's actually made the argument that AI for Earth should actually be referred to as Earth for AI, because he sees Microsoft is using AI for Earth in order to generate environmental data that they're using to monetize their AI and their algorithms in other contexts, and specifically in ways that ultimately exacerbate the climate crisis and that isn't good for the environment. So these are issues that we really want to dig into more over the next year. Lee,
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much.
So, Jim, and Lee, I love the presentation and the ideas that you explore. And I have a couple of thoughts that came to mind throughout the presentation. Probably the biggest is that I kept seeing, as you're going through, major parallels actually with global health and with the creation of this global health security paradigm that really came out of the HIV, TB, and malaria crisis of the late 90s and early part of the 21st century, and also came out of concern at the state security level with pandemics and with pandemic preparedness. So without going into a long history, what really happened was this massive shift away from global health as an equity-oriented approach to improving people's health, well-being, giving people better access to pharmaceuticals, diagnostics, and vaccines, to global health surveillance with a view to protecting the national security of major players. And the most important player and driver of global health systems is the United States. And I don't say that in any kind of judgmental or disparaging way. The fact is that the United States funds about 55% of all international development assistance and about 60 to 70% of all humanitarian assistance in the world. And now when they decide to shift their interests or their perspective, that shifts everything in terms of how a system actually functions. So that shift happened in global health, and there is now, people talk very kind of, people talk about global health security as an approach to global health. I actually oppose it just by virtue of what it's about, what its personal, what its impetus is. Its fundamental goal is to protect the national security of so-called donor governments. And very operationally, that's meant a shift away from supporting the provision of care to supporting the gathering of data on health issues and on health threats, and largely around infectious disease. And this is kind of transmuted into a very, very ambitious program on pandemic preparedness and response. And so that's the first big thought that comes to mind. And there are parallels that exist in very recent history, but I think the significance of what you're talking about is far greater than what we've experienced in the global health community specifically. I also think that what's clear, not just from your presentation, but more globally, we're in the middle of what many call the fourth revolution, right? And it is a digital revolution, and we're literally right in the middle of it. And we are, as human beings, we're remaking our conception and our perception, as one of your referred book authors called it, our perception of reality through digital tools, technologies, and lenses. And the technology, we are shaping the technology is shaping us, and is shaping our perception. And I think that's a very, it may sound like a kind of a, obvious observation, but I think it's very fundamental. And it's important, that we think about it. And some of the authors that you referred to, Masumi and Dowie, specifically, certainly do imbibe, that perspective, and I think quite fulsomely. The other thing, and it's more of a challenge, I just sort of want to put this to you. I've seen protection efforts of wildlife and conservation efforts, largely in Africa. That's most of my experience, and most especially over the last 10 years. There has been a very significant shift in conservation from exactly what you described, from addressing root causes to enforcement. And I must say, it's been incredibly effective. And we see, for example, the number of lions, the number of rhinos, the number of elephants, which were literally on the verge of complete decimation, of elimination. This has changed radically in the last 10 years. So now when I reflect on it, I think, wow, so what is it that forced, or that, I won't say forced, what is it that led to that approach? Well, if I sort of reflect in the broadest possible terms, we've had 250 years of rapacious growth and activity under the Industrial Revolution kind of framework and the post-Enlightenment world and all of that. And that has been a world of massive competing passions of human beings, to put it in the most general terms. And that competition of passions has led to a situation where the very viability of the human species is at risk, and that is marked by the sixth great extinction, which we are in. We are causing the death and the loss and death of many, many species. We've massively remade the ecosystem. We've done all kinds of terrible things, and we now live with climate change, which is very much with us. So, with some kind of a recognition that there's a problem in the context that I'm talking about, Africa and loss of species, at some point one has to make a decision about what are you going to do in the face of this crisis. And if you simply try to reshape the passions that human beings are expressing, there are consequences to that, right? There are timeline consequences, and in the context of the species that I was talking about, if those efforts had not been made over the last 10 years in Africa, across the continent of Africa, we probably would not have rhinos. Rhinos would be extinct. Lions would likely be extinct at this point. So I'm not in any way saying, go for enforcement 100%, but I'm saying enforcement is part of the response, right? And it has to be. Otherwise, we have to say, well, we accept that there are consequences that are remediable, but we choose not to remediate against those consequences. So I just put that to you as a challenge, and I'd love to hear your response.
Yeah, I'll respond really briefly and hopefully give Lee a chance to hop into before we sign off. I guess on the first point that you made about the parallels with global health, I would say that I totally agree. I see this exact same trends in conservation, that this move has been led by the US, that this move toward enforcement first and digital policing and conservation has been led by the US Fish and Wildlife Service and the US Department of State and the US like Drug and Narcotics Control Office. They've all been funding this around the world. I think on the last point that you were raising around the sort of imperative and that sort of time sensitiveness to work to preserve these threatened species, I will say that the context in Africa and Southeast Asia is different than the one in Belize where we're working. It's much, I think, more dire. The levels of poaching are much different, and yeah, the threat to species is much higher. So it is a different context in those situations. There's certainly a place for enforcement, a role for that to play. But I think one of the concerns that I have with this model of enforcement first that we see, and specifically in Southern Africa as well, like in countries like Botswana, for example, they have a shoot to kill policy in their national parks, where if a ranger sees anyone in there, they can kill them on site without any legal process having taken place. And I just don't agree that those types of things should be happening. And I think the flip side is that I think that these enforcement first approaches often target the poorest people kind of at the bottom of these illegal wildlife chains that are really, struggling to make a living. And I think there's a case to be made that we need to be working to address these larger systemic issues that are driving, the poaching of wildlife at an economic scale, rather than focusing on sort of eliminating, individual poachers in parks and protected areas. But I want to give Lee a chance to talk on this, because I know he's doing his PhD on these types of things. So I'd love to hear what he has to say about it as well.
Yeah, just in reference to the situation described in Africa, I 100% agree. But I think one of the issues, and Jim touched on this, is that it's being treated as a kind of carbon copy approach that can be expanded around the world. And this happened in Latin America. The major conservation NGOs in partnership with the US Department of State were designing illegal wildlife trade strategies to tackle that based on experiences in Africa. But to do that, you'd have to assume that the situation between communities and illegal traders with Chinese markets are exactly the same in Latin America as they are in Africa. And what that also does is kind of replicate a kind of meeting force with force approach that's suitable for Africa, and is transplanting that to a different location where it may not be necessary, and in many cases has proven not to be necessary. So you end up kind of looking for a problem that's not there in every case. So I think that's one of the dangers of trying to transplant one situation to another, and that's what's then shifted this conservation funding landscape towards enforcement, because there's been an understanding that everything's going to end up like Africa, whereas I think there's a growing research that that's not necessarily the case, and that's a dangerous assumption to make.
That's a great answer, or a great reflection, Lee and Jim. And I'd just say that one thing that you did refer to, Jim, two things that you referred to that I thought, wow, this is really good. You referred to the surveillance system that has emerged post 9/11. And just for the people, I'm sure people are aware, but this is, it's called TIA, Total Information Awareness. And it is a $1 trillion system that has been constructed by the United States to have complete awareness of every single digital transmission in the world, and to be able to identify trigger words or keywords or phrases or patterns through metadata analysis or through other mechanisms, to preempt exactly what you're talking about, to preempt certain behaviors. So that I think it's quite important that you actually articulate that more fulsomely in how you describe what you're doing, what your research is doing, and also that so that's really important. That's number one. And then the other thing that I think is really important is a little comment that you made, Jim, in your presentation that I think is actually the most important thing that you said. It's that this new approach, it does not deal or does not recognize root causes. It's simply preemptive. That's what it is. So it's preempting a potential or a probabilistic outcome, right? So, and by definition, the way it's structured, it avoids recognizing or dealing with root causes. And that, I think, is the opportunity, if you will, within the research, to beyond describing the phenomenon, which, you're obviously doing very well, you're doing incredibly well. The opportunity is to take the description and try to reframe the approach, right? So that there is not a mutually exclusive choice between enforcement versus prevention or root cause engagement, but that there's a convergence of these, right? And so that means that, for example, conservation does not mean displacement. Why should expanding conservation territory, which is obviously needed, why does that, by definition, equal displacement of Indigenous peoples? To me, that's logically inconsistent. But it requires a reframing, of the approach, and I think that's really, the opportunity that can come out from what is obviously, very well done research. And congratulations to both of you for that. I mean, you're really getting at something that is very, very important and needs to be described and illuminated and shared. But the reframing, I think, is really a critical element to it. And with that, I'm going to close because we're 5 minutes over, and unfortunately, that's just the tyranny of time. Here we are. So thank you both, Jim and Lee, for your presentation. It was great. Thank you.
Thank you
very much.
And with that, I'm supposed to make an announcement. Sorry about that. Next week's seminar is Tuesday. It's on Tuesday, not Wednesday, April 18. It's at noon, and it's with Harvey Skinner and Susan Harris. And the title is Climate Distress, Helping Ourselves and Healing Our Planet. Today, last little announcement, today's the last day to apply for the Critical Perspectives in Global Health Seed Grant program. The applications are due today. So with that, I'll just say again, thank you, Jim and Lee, for great presentation, and we'll see everybody next week. Bye for now.